Alex and Andrew for inviting me. And also, I'm just getting over a bit of a cold, so if I have lots of coughing, I apologize in advance. Hopefully, it won't happen too much. So today I'm talking about null models for networks. So first, just a brief overview. I'll go through the basics of what is a null model, why might you use it, how would you use them, what sort of questions can you answer with them. I'll go through the two main classes of null model. Sorry, not as tall as the other guys, my apologies. The two main classes, generative models and rewiring methods, and then I'll just finish with a little bit about, for functional connectivity, you've got a few extra options that you can use that can get a bit more information out of your data. Okay, so the basic problem is this, right? So you get a network, you measure something about it, and you get some property X, some value X. Like, how do you know whether X is big or small, right? Like, say you're measuring the length of something or the weight of something. We have a kind of good intuition for this sort of thing, but for lots of network properties, they're quite abstract. Like, to know what's a normal number for clustering, we don't really have a good intuition for this sort of thing. How do you know whether something is, how do you know whether the thing you measured is actually specific to this network? Is there something really special and you should hurry up, write up your paper now because this is some amazing finding? Or does everyone already know about this property because actually it's kind of generic and it exists in a lot of different networks? And the most interesting part, I think, is, can you get at what's the mechanism for how this feature came about? What sort of wiring rules might be needed to get this property? So the common thing we need here is some sort of frame of reference, to understand how this network property might come about. And so those considerations actually apply to almost anything you can measure. But in the specific case of networks, we have an extra sort of wrinkle to deal with, and that's the fact that there's a lot of properties that depend quite trivially on, say, the size of the network or the average node degree. So the degree is just the number of connections that each node makes. Or the density, and we've already seen in Alex and Andrew's talks various ways that thresholding can change these things. So people have looked at this for a bunch of metrics and a bunch of different sizes and densities and whatnot. So I'm not going to go through all the details here, but a couple of key examples are things like if you have a lattice, if you make your lattice bigger, you need more hops to get from one place to the next, and this just depends on the size of the network. And a lot of networks, if they're denser, you get more closed triangles, you get higher clustering. But just because you have that doesn't necessarily mean that this has been explicitly wired for. So that's why it's actually an important practical consideration. Because say when you want to compare two networks that have different numbers of nodes, maybe two people, two groups that had different parcellations or something, and you find some difference in some measure, how do you know that the difference was due to, not just due to the different size of the networks? You want some way, this might exaggerate some effect or it might hide some effect. So you want some way of, teasing these features apart. So that's where null models come in, right? So the basic idea is that you decide on some set of properties that you want to keep constant. And you put these in, these key bits you hold, and then everything else you leave unconstrained. And then, so particularly say if you're randomizing the rest, this lets you build up a null distribution. So this is actually very similar to what Andrew was just showing with MBS, how you build through permutation some null distribution. And this gives you some reference to decide, okay, is the thing that I measured special or not? So you can build up some null distribution, and I have plotted there in blue. Say you measured your X. If it looks nothing like your distribution, it's unlikely to be explained by that null model. If that value is in the bulk of what you see, maybe this mechanism is part of what you have here. So this is the same basic idea that you get in null hypothesis testing, the same idea you have just for model comparison, model testing in general. Just does my model reproduce this feature of the data well? And I should also point out there's a lot of different names for these procedures. Sometimes surrogate networks, I'll probably end up saying surrogate a lot because I actually prefer surrogate to null. Benchmarks, I think we've already heard benchmark today as well, some reference network, synthetic network, lots of names for the same thing. So as I mentioned up the top, there's two main classes. There's generative models and rewiring models. So in generative models, you start from scratch, right? You choose the mechanisms and then you build your network starting with nothing. So this is like a bottom-up approach. But there's also top-down approaches in rewiring where you start with your empirical network and then you rewire it. So here, instead of choosing the mechanism, here you choose the constraint, right? You choose which pieces you want to keep fixed while you randomize everything else. So there's a ton of these. There's a lot of models out there, and this is one. There's like a whole zoo of them, but they have a kind of taxonomy. This is one such taxonomy. The details are not particularly important, except you should take away the fact that they're typically hierarchical. So with each additional constraint you apply, you start capturing finer and finer features of the networks. And there's a lot of different choices you might need to make, to put you which level of the hierarchy you're on. Like, is the model you use stochastic or is it deterministic? Are the nodes predetermined or do you grow a network? And is the network just an abstract mathematical model, the sorts that are commonly used in graph theory, or is it an actual spatial one? So I'm going to give a few examples of a bunch of these. So first is a very, very famous, completely abstract model. And among the stochastic ones, it's basically the absolute simplest. You just put edges in completely at random with some fixed probability. So on the right there, I've got a plot of just nodes. This is just illustrative. As I said, it's abstract. I just put some circles in random positions and then joined them with red edges. And on the right, the far right, is the corresponding connectivity matrix. So the way this network proceeds, you just start with a set of edges, a set of nodes. You put your edges in, and you will do it. You'll set the same number of nodes, say, as your empirical network that you want to match, and you'll add edges until you have the same density as the network you want to match. Or you could choose to have, put edges in until you have the same number of edges. The difference isn't that big a deal. And one nice thing about this, because it's so simple, there's actually a lot of analytic results out there. So mathematicians have solved a lot of closed form results for a lot of the different network properties. So often you don't even need to generate an ensemble. You can just kind of skip straight to the end and say, okay, this is the expected various properties of your network. And also, like a lot of the routines that Andrew was showing, this one exists in Brain Connectivity Toolbox, as do a lot of things. I mean, that's kind of, if you're a MATLAB user and working in networks, you basically will always download that because it has a whole bunch of very, very useful routines that are just highly reliable and easy to use. One downside of the Erdős-Rényi model is that actually it has quite a narrow degree distribution. It's it's binomial or roughly Gaussian in the large limit. So that means all the nodes are kind of similar to each other. And in the brain, and I think there's later talk we'll see on hubs, this isn't so much the case. So there's times where you don't necessarily want to use this model because you don't get enough heterogeneity in your connectivity profiles. One model that doesn't have that issue is the Barabasi-Albert model. And this is also an example of growing a network. So here, you actually just start with a very small network with a predetermined connectivity, and then you iteratively add nodes and connect them to the ones that are already there. And you don't just connect them completely randomly, you connect them to, in proportion to with a probability in proportion to how many connections those nodes already have. So that means it's kind of like a Ponzi scheme. Like the nodes that got in earliest are going to be the richest ones, and all the later ones will not, will be weaker and weaker. And again, you can just grow it until you have the same number of nodes, and by choosing the overall scaling of the probability, you can again match the density of your network. And the reason that people like this one is that it has a scale-free distribution, because there's a lot of networks just outside neuroscience. Broadly, I once saw some applied maths talk where the guy was like, all real networks are scale-free, which is probably a slight exaggeration, but they're quite ubiquitous, right? And the key thing is that these guys then have hubs. You have nodes that have way more connections than the average. And Another super famous one that you will certainly encounter, this is like one of the highest cited maths papers going around, is the super famous Watson-Strogatz model. So this one's actually interesting because it touches on a couple of features of other models I'll talk about later, and that it kind of has a spatial embedding, even though actually it's completely abstract, but because it's typically done on a ring, so it seems like a 2D object, but the wiring rule ignores the actual spatial arrangement. And the fact that the creation of this one involves rewiring. So you have this you start with a lattice, and then with some probability you rewire all your edges to just go connect to other ones. So this introduces a lot of shortcuts. So in the limit, you have at one end of the limit, you have a perfect regular lattice and no stochasticity. And at the other limit, you basically just have an Otis-Renyi graph again. And people like this one because the in-between region is a small world network. So all these connections you move go and make long-range shortcuts across the network. But again, kind of like Otis-Renyi, it has a narrow degree distribution. So there'll be times when, if you want to have strong hubs, this model won't capture that. As I said, the wiring rule in there is completely abstract, right? So a lot of the methods in graph theory come from abstract graphs where there's no cost to putting in a connection. So like say if you have the network of citations on Wikipedia or the network of scientific citations, there's no cost to citing another paper. There's a small cost, right? If the reviewer wants some really annoying reference, that hurts a little bit, but it's a minor cost, right? But there's no actual physical cost to having these connections. But a lot of networks are not like that. They're real-world networks. Like in the brain, it costs energy and atoms to build axons and run them and put action potentials along them. It costs money to build roads and railways and electricity grids and whatnot. So you tend to find in these networks, long-range connections are not. There's some sort of penalty against long-range connections, right? You only want to have them if you really need them. And so one feature that often emerges in that case then is having an exponential decay in wiring, in the strength of connections or the probability of long connections. So in the connectomics case, we actually there's really good track tracing data in mouse and macaque, lots of species now, where you see this exponential decay in probability. And there's also in diffusion imaging data, you also see a very similar exponential decay. But we can flip this around, right? So we can build a model out of this where we say, okay, we'll make this our wiring rule. Instead of just throwing the edges completely randomly, ignoring the actual spatial locations, we can throw them in with an exponentially decaying probability or have the weights decay exponentially. So this lets you ask a more refined question, not just how might this come about by chance, but under the constraint that the brain is a real physical object, does this network feature need a special wiring rule? And it turns out, so people have done this. If you run this wiring rule, you can match degree distributions, path length distributions, clustering coefficient distributions, between centralities. If you're only interested in matching the means of these, you can even, instead of running this on a proper shaped brain, you can do it on a sphere and you can still match all of these features. You can get complex things like motif distributions. It's actually quite a powerful rule. This means the brain gets a lot of this wiring, a lot of complex features without having our DNA doesn't have to have explicitly coded to go and make a lot of these features. So evolution will no doubt have exploited this to its benefit. And again, mentioning those hierarchies of models, so Rick Betzel, who you'll be hearing from later, he's looked at then, well, what if you say, okay, having these geometric constraints gets you a lot of the way to the brain, but there's still a lot of, it's still not a perfect brain, right? The brain's still more complex than that. If you want to add another rule to do, how can we do better? So if you have the nodes, then also try and attach to, like nodes with similar connectivity profiles connecting to nodes with other similar connectivity profiles, then you can do, the next big leap again in how well your model represents the real networks. So I think that's a really nice example of how having these hierarchy of models that you ask successively refined questions about what sort of wiring rules give you the connector. Yeah, the key idea of generative models, you start from scratch, you put your ingredients in, and then you leave everything else unconstrained, and then you grow your networks, and then this gives you a reference, right? But we can go from the other direction, top down, start with the network, and then rewire it under constraints that we choose. So the simplest case is, again, like an unconstrained one, right? You just rewire things randomly, and that's kind of like an equivalent to the Erdős-Rényi. And there's if you have weighted networks and you're not interested in actually physically changing the binary adjacency, you can just shuffle the weights on there, for instance, and completely break all your structure. But this also tends to give you narrower degree distributions, kind of like Erdős-Rényi. So by far the most commonly used method, this one, we use like these RAND-MIO routines in Brain Connectivity Toolbox so often that we just refer to it as RAND-MIO, but people often, they're degree-preserving random networks. In neuroscience, we call them a lot of the times Maslov-Sneppen rewiring after a particular really highly cited science paper, but actually these routines go back like 100 years. They've sort of been reinvented many times. So the key essence of how these ones work is that you swap pairs of edges. So say you just choose a pair of edges at random. So you have A connects to B, C connects to D, and then you swap them. So now A connects to C and B to D, or you could do A to D and B to C. And you just keep doing this over and over and over again. And then eventually, you keep doing it until you've fully, that processes converge and you're up with a random network. So the key thing with this one is that you preserve degree, right? So say you start with a network here, I've plotted one on the left. The bigger red and orange circles are the hubs, and then green connections are hub-to-hub connections, and the black ones are hub to non-hub connections. And then in that connectivity matrix, you can see there's that big block structure from the left and right hemispheres. But if you have, when you use degree-preserving surrogates, you maintain the positions of where all those hubs are, right? Those orange and red circles haven't moved, but all the other wiring gets randomized under that constraint. And this, for instance, will break that really strong hemisphericity in the connectivity matrix. And for instance, if you calculate modularity, these surrogate networks don't, even though you still have hubs, they don't form modules. So the modularity is like a quarter of what you see in the real brain. And clustering, half as clustered. So the real brain is twice as clustered as you might expect from having these surrogates. So the thing is, one of the reasons you'll come across this method so often is that it's actually used now in the definition of various quantities. So like, for instance, some popular measures of small worldness will calculate this as a ratio of normalized clustering and path length, where this normalization is done relative to degree-preserving random networks. And there's a really nice example, which is in the Rich Club coefficient, which we'll hear more about later. But just very briefly, this is about strong nodes that connect to each other more than you would expect by chance. But that more than you expect by chance is done relative to normalizing against these surrogates. Because actually when the Rich Club coefficient was first introduced, the first definition didn't do that and would have that random networks have a special Rich Club formation, which doesn't really capture what you mean by having these things actually preferentially connect to each other. So it's a good example of how degree-preserving surrogates, they're not just a method in and of themselves. They actually become subsumed into the definitions of other metrics that we use. And again, with this hierarchy of things, you can add other rules on top, right? So you can, in like the spatial generative models, you can have spatial surrogate models. So you say with this swapping, you can only swap, say, if it doesn't increase the wiring cost. Or you can even actively try and make it shorter by just always hunting until you find a swap that really makes it a lot shorter. But this can the more constraints you put on your swapping, it gets slower and slower because you end up having to discard a lot of swaps because they don't satisfy all your constraints. You can really see a striking difference between when you try to not increase the cost. If you don't increase the cost, if you don't try to preserve the cost, then you get much, much, much longer wiring. So those normal degree-preserving surrogates, again, it's a topological randomization. They ignore the spatial properties. But if you then take this into account, you can start getting, you can find that these spatial surrogate networks lie sort of halfway between random network, fully random networks, and the real brain in small worldness, clustering coefficient, global efficiency, lots of different metrics. And we've done some work on this too. So a good way to visualize what's going on here, right? So remember I mentioned there was this exponential decay. So you have that blue cloud of points is an exponentially decaying cloud of points, the strengths of the connections against the distance. All right, if you just randomize ignoring that, you just smear that cloud. You end up with all these really long, strong connections and short, weak connections, for instance. And anyone can become a hub then, in that case, if you just completely ignore how you shuffle. But the interesting thing is if you actually try and instead shuffle while preserving that cloud, so instead of just preserving the weights by shuffling them, you try and preserve the relationship between the weights and distance. An interesting thing happens where all the hubs actually move to the middle of the brain, so out of the, on average. So the brain is like a really special member of this ensemble, which is, we've had then various follow-ups, comparing this sensitivity of the hubs to randomization, relating it to schizophrenia, and that was a collaboration with Andrew, actually. It's in that Golo et al. Paper, which will be out soon. And also those red and green bar charts, these show the strength distribution. So strength is like the weighted version of degree, the sum of all the weights of your connections. These runs where if you just randomize, you tend to get, kind of like with the Otis-Renyi, you tend to get narrower distributions. So you can then have, again, a hierarchy of models, right, where you can say, okay, I want to preserve the cloud of points, but I also want to get the strengths back. So you can sacrifice a little bit of your weight preservation to then get the strengths back, and you can have these RSS and GSS ones are kind of like the equivalent of the degree-preserving surrogates, except a weighted version. And again, you get, so we already saw modularity for when you just randomize ignoring geometry, you lose all your modules. But the interesting thing is, if you have space, these geometry-preserving ones, you actually preserve your modularity. So in fact, you end up with, these geometric surrogates have about 90% of the modularity of the real brain, which is pretty interesting. So you don't have to have a special wiring rule to get modules. Just having things have an exponential cost penalty, you get this. And it's true for clustering as well, kind of like all the other results I showed from the SAMU paper. Clustering is sort of midway between the real brain and the surrogates. So, for rewiring methods, you can start with an empirical network, you choose what you want to keep fixed, and then you randomly rewire the rest. So compared to generative models, these tend to preserve more of the data. So because, for instance, you'll have preserved like the exact set of weights rather than, say, generating fresh random ones each time. But and they can sometimes be faster and sometimes slower. So for the edge swapping ones, these can be quite a bit slower because if you have a lot of constraints, you may need to discard quite a lot of your swaps. But for the shuffling ones that I showed, these can be fast because shuffling is quite fast. So now, just in the last little bit of the talk, I'll go through surrogates for functional connectivity. So you can use some of the previous methods, but you have to be a bit careful, right? Because as Alex mentioned, a functional connectivity matrix is not, there's extra levels of constraints by the nature of what correlations are like, right? If A and B are strongly correlated with each other, and A is strongly correlated with C, and B and C, there's some bound on how correlated they will be. So you can't just completely randomize a correlation matrix and necessarily end up with a correlation matrix. You might actually generate a matrix that's no longer a correlation matrix. And the other very important thing is that here you're talking about a summary of some dynamics in time, right? This is not just a static functional or static structural connectivity, a fixed wiring map. There's an actual dynamical system under there, and there's a whole extra lot of tools you can use once you have a dynamical system, which I'll mention in a moment. So, Andrew already mentioned this, helpfully, so I don't have to go into this too much. It is possible to generate under that constraint that the matrix that you're randomizing is still a correlation matrix. There are methods for dealing with this, and Andrew has a paper looking into these. But I think the more powerful approach is to generate surrogate time series, so go back to the data on which you've been calculating your functional connectivity on, and randomize there, and then calculate your functional connectivity or dynamic functional connectivity, rather than just doing it at the level of the network. And actually, this has a really long history in EEG. So there used to be, there was a quest to find chaos in the brain and find nonlinearity in the brain, right, in like the late 80s and early 90s. Lots of physics papers on like, oh, we found all these things. And then people come along later using null models and say, well, actually, these features that you found are not so special because you can come up with null models that reproduce them. So using these sort of time series methods, there's two common choices, right? One, they're very well developed in the physics literature and time series analysis literature more broadly. So one is Fourier surrogates. So Fourier transforms can decompose a signal into different frequencies and their amplitudes. If you basically preserve their amplitudes, but you randomize the phases of these frequencies, you can preserve the power spectrum of a signal, but break a lot of all the phase relationships. And that's important because once you break all these phase relationships, you break possible nonlinearities, because nonlinear processes tend to impose relationships between the different phases. So, and another class, which is actually closely related because Fourier methods are related to, well, Fourier power spectra are related to autocorrelations, for instance, but there's another whole class of models called autoregressive models. So these depend on the system at the time now and on time points in the past. And you can choose how many time points in the past. And so you can use these to then generate fresh time series, having fit the model to the data. So it's kind of like a generative model, you could argue. So there was a very recent paper out of Singapore, actually, and there's a parallel session with this one, but of course you guys are all going to stay here and not go to that session, where Raphael Lijois, a nice paper showing that actually it turns out if you use these surrogate methods, a lot of the dynamics that you see in sliding window correlations, that's what that SWC label is on those axes, a lot of the things that appear to be dynamic, when they are dynamics, things are changing, right? But you don't actually need to have some underlying model with a parameter that is moving around. So you can have a model with fixed parameters, but noise input that can give you quite rich dynamics like what you see. Whereas some of the other null models that you use that don't take into account as much of the temporal structure, you don't necessarily see that. So if you're interested in that, you should read that Neuroimage paper. Because there's probably going to be arguments right now in that session about whether the dynamic functional connectivity exists or not, because these guys argue that the stationary linear Gaussian null hypothesis can't be rejected for HCP subjects, basically, for most of them, which is somewhat controversial. Okay, so the take-home message is this, right? Null models for networks basically let you, probe, given a network, try and work out what are the mechanisms by which this feature came about. Should I be interested in it or not? Is it surprising or not? What sort of wiring rules do I need? And there's a hierarchy of these methods, right? So you don't, it's up to you to choose really what features you want to preserve, right? If you think that it's a very simple topological thing, maybe you can use a very simple topological model. If you think, oh, maybe this comes down to the actual spatial configuration of the nodes, on actual wiring costs from how long axons are, not even just Euclidean distances, things like this, you can build these into your models. If you think that there's a particular growth rule that was used, like preferential attachment or something like this, you can build this into your model and test it and then just see. You don't have to speculate. You can just generate synthetic models and compare synthetic networks and compare them to your empirical one. And again, I should stress, get the brain connectivity toolbox. It's, It's just standard. And for our particular bits of code, you can get them from Michael Breakspear's lab's website. And also Alex and Andrew's book is very good on these things. So yes, thank you.